Being recorded.
Okay, thank you, Judith. And I'll just go through our regular instructions and welcoming. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And this is the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's stakeholder meeting for New Jersey Administrative Code, Title VII, Chapter 36, subchapters 25 and 26. And this will apply to the post-Green Acres funding compliance requirements for local parkland. And we advertise this meeting for the general public, but we're welcoming all our interested stakeholders, whether it's local government partners or nonprofit partners. And maybe we'll have a few more folks join us. So this is for the new rulemaking we're doing in the Office of Transactions and Public Land Administration, or OTPLA for short. And today is January 24th, 2023. And this meeting is going to be taking place from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Folks don't have to stay on that whole time. Feel free to leave when you need to. We're going to be available that time. So if folks want to come back on, we'll be available to speak. And my name is Caroline Keefe, and I'm the Regulatory Officer in the Public Land Compliance section of the Office of Transactions and Public Land Administration. And I'm going to be helping out as the moderator today. Okay, the general disclaimer to start the meeting. The information presented during this meeting is intended to facilitate discussion on various existing and potential regulatory mechanisms. No final agency decision regarding this information is expressed or implied, and this meeting is being recorded. So it looks like we have a pretty small group today, but we're still going to review attendance. So we can have a record of attendance for those attending via the Teams link. If you could put your first and last name and affiliation in the chat box. And if you've dialed in to the meeting or can't access the chat box, we ask that you email your name, phone number, and affiliation to our email address at otpla@dep.nj.gov. That's going to be on the slide too, but for those of you who can't see it, it's otpla@dep.nj.gov. And that helps us keep track. This is a small group, but I think we're probably not going to have a speaking limit, but we just ask for those of you who have access to the chat, when you want to speak, well, as the meeting progresses, please keep your microphone muted and your camera turned off. To request the opportunity to respond or ask a question, please enter your name and affiliation in the chat box. When called on to speak, you may unmute yourself, and if you'd like, turn on your camera. And when you finish speaking, we ask to remute yourself and turn off your camera. And for call-in attendees or those who don't have access to the chat, we're going to be taking breaks. And with such a small group, I think we don't have to, be so strict with this. And in terms of the allotting 3 minutes per speaker, I don't think that's going to be necessary today. For technical problems, you can ask for assistance in the chat or send an email to us at otpla@dep.nj.gov. And just a reminder that everyone is welcome to submit written comments and questions to our team at any time at our email address. Just include rulemaking in the subject line. And we thank everyone who's submitted oral and written comments thus far. It's been very productive. Okay, at this time, I'd like to introduce Judith N.J.A.C. She's the Assistant Director in the Office of Transactions and Public Land Administration. And Judith, I yield the floor to you.
Thanks, Caroline. So some of you may know that almost a year ago, we had a reorganization here at DEP. And until that time, Nancy Lawrence, who was also helping us moderate, wave to the folks, Nancy. Caroline and I were part of the Green Acres program, and we and another section from Green Acres were pulled into this new office called Transactions and Public Land Administration. The purpose of the reorganization was to centralize certain functions, including legal review of contracts and grants, and legal oversight of both DEP-owned land and preserve land in which the department has an interest, such as Green Acres and Cumbert Parkland. So on the screen here, the organization chart is a little small to be able to read, but I'll give you an overview of the office's functions. So in the middle, in kind of the pale orange color, what some of you may have known as the Bureau of Legal Services and Stewardship in the Green Acres program is now the Public Land Compliance section within the Office of Transactions and Public Land Administration. That's the center part of the chart, and that's the section that's most directly responsible for the parts of the Green Acres rules that we'll be talking about today. And Nancy Lawrence is the manager of that section. Over on the left where it says Public Land Administration, some of you may know that section as having been the Office of Leases and Concessions that was formerly in the Office of the Assistant Commissioner for Natural and Historic Resources. That assistant commissionership no longer exists, and the Office of Leases and Concessions was pulled into this new office. So it's now the Public Land Administration section, and it's headed by Adria Wenzel as the manager. Over on the right, in kind of the pale purple color, is what we now know as our Legal and Transactional Operations section. This is essentially the Green Acres closing team, headed by Lauren Persida as the manager, and consists mostly of the paralegals who help handle our real estate closings. But as I mentioned, that section is also doing contract and grant review for other programs in DEP, but we're not here to talk about that today. Up top, the new office is headed by Rob Guzak, who I don't think is on the phone with us as director, and I'm the assistant director. So again, this office was intended to bring a lot of functions related to administration of both the department's own land and other publicly preserved land into one place to ensure consistency of decision making, and to hopefully over time improve the efficiency with which we respond to requests to use properties both DEP owned and locally owned. So for purposes of the upcoming rulemaking, our team is our director, Rob Guzak, myself, Nancy Lawrence, and Caroline Keefe, our regulatory officer. So what we're here to talk about today is what right now is part of the Green Acres rules. And if you go to the chat where you've been entering your name and affiliation, at the top of today's portion of the chat, we provided some links. One is to the existing rules, one is to a hot topics document. We also included the email address if you need to communicate with us either during or after the meeting. Right now, subchapters 25 and 26 of the Green Acres rules apply to post-funding compliance requirements. Everything that comes before that has to do with how you get funding. Subchapter 25 outlines what our expectations are as far as managing property if you take Green Acres funding to acquire or develop it. These rules apply both to directly funded parkland and to what we refer to as unfunded parkland, which are the other parks that municipalities and counties are required to put on their recreation and open space inventories as a condition of taking Green Acres funding. And then subchapter 26 right now is primarily what people know as our diversion application process. So for those occasions where someone wants to request that we lift the Green Acres restriction from a park, subchapter 26 has a pretty detailed process for how you can make that request. So you may have seen in the notice of this meeting that we last made substantive changes to these rules in 2005. And those of you who have attended the State Land Trust Conference or other presentations that we've given since then have been hearing us say for a long time that we intend to update the rules. So that time is now. But with the new reorganization, we're going to pull subchapters 25 and 26 out of the Green Acres rules and put them in a new chapter specific to the new office. There may be other topics that we end up covering in those rules as well, but they would not be specific to Green Acres funding. So we're here to talk today, not to talk about how you can obtain Green Acres funding and what the process is for funding, but to talk about what happens, as I like to put it, after you have the ribbon cutting and hand out the big fake check from Greenacres, and then Martha Sapp's office hands the file to Nancy and says, "Here, we did this great project, and you need to keep track of it for all eternity to make sure that the property we help buy or develop stays as parkland." So our purpose in convening these meetings is to listen to those of you who've had experience with our post-funding requirements, talk about what you like, what you don't like, what you think we should change. And those of you who maybe haven't taken our money, why our requirements might have deterred you from taking the funding. I believe there's a little concern that's been expressed over the hot topics list that we distributed. That list was intended to spur discussion, but to some degree, the topics on that list reflect things we get asked about on a regular basis and that we think we might have to address in the new rules. But early on in the stakeholdering process back in November, when we first announced these meetings and released the hot topics, there was some reaction to the fact that we put leases, the word leases, on our hot topics list. And for those of you not familiar with that process, we do review leases now for Greenacres funded parkland and for unfunded parkland. And we do want back on that process, whether it's too difficult, whether there's other things we should consider. But it was not intended to be a prompt that we are considering wholesale commercialization of local parks. So I just want to put that concern to rest if I possibly can. And so, as Caroline and I have already both mentioned, and as stated on that list is just for discussion purposes. We have not made any decisions. We really do want people's feedback, and this is one of several meetings where we're going to try to solicit it. We do have 2 additional meetings scheduled after this one this Thursday at 1 o'clock, and one in the evening next week on the 31st at 6 o'clock. I should also mention, as far as the timing of this meeting, that we advertised that we would conduct the meeting from 1 to 3 o'clock, but it would extend it for up to an additional hour if there was need to receive additional comment. I think for the number of people we have on the phone right now, that unless we have a lot of additional people join us, we probably would end the meeting no later than 3 o'clock. And depending on if everybody's commented, we might stop the recording and resume if other people join later. We are recording this session. We will post the video of this session on the website in the same place as the public notice once our IT people make it available for public distribution. And as Caroline already mentioned, if after the session you have things you want to bring to our attention or you have comments you just don't want to make on the record today, please just send us an email to the address at the bottom of the slide, otpla@dep.nj.gov. And please just put the word rulemaking in the subject line so we can sort through the emails more easily. We'll be collecting written comment all through this process before we take pen to paper and try to incorporate all your comments and all the things we want to update in the rules. So I'm going to hand this back to Caroline and Nancy to determine the order of commenters. I will jump in to respond as it seems appropriate if you have comments or questions that we can address. But we are here to listen and to get your input. Back to you, Caroline.
Okay, so maybe actually just type in start discussion. It's just a small group, but I think we can still use some of our same. So yes, so those of you who have access to the Teams through the Teams link with the chat, if you please put your name in the chat, I think, or if you don't have access, if you could do the raise hand. But it looks like there's 6. Is that correct? So I think we can, we'll have enough time and flexibility to go through if anyone has something they would want to say. Alternatively,
yeah, I think right now we only have 3 non-DEP attendees, and we have 1 DEP attendee from another program. So, Rob, you put your name and affiliation in the chat first. Would you like to comment? And if you don't want to, feel free to decline in the chat, just so we know.
Or maybe we can just go over our hot topics and just talk about some of the issues and
Well, let's
topics.
see if the guests had anything specific they wanted to comment on, and then, yeah, we can go through that list.
Oh,
sorry,
okay.
My computer has no video or audio listening mode. Well, Rob, feel free to send us an email. I know you had a bit of experience with trying to figure out whether something going on in Hamilton was or was not a diversion. So if you have any lessons learned from that process that you'd like to share with us or comments, feel free to send us an email. Our guest from Camden, was there anything specific you wanted to comment on?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so apologies, I'm not a land use attorney, and I did quickly read over some of this regulation, but it is not my area of expertise, so I'm sort of a member of the community that's generally interested in green acres and generally in favor of the program. I'm kind of a single issue person on this call, and my single issue is meaningful public access, that clause of green acres. And if this regulation can in any way more clearly define the meaningful public access rule of green acres awarded property in the state of New Jersey, and possibly more clearly define that regulation and strengthen that regulation. In Camden, New Jersey, there is a good amount of green acres property that exists, but some of it's in areas of the city and being used in a way that does not maintain meaningful public access, in my view and in my interpretation. Rutgers University Camden of Camden, in conjunction with the city of Camden, has used Green Acres funding for their NCAA university athletic fields. When those fields were, the first iteration of those fields were originally opened, they were named the Rutgers Camden, quote, community fields. But unfortunately, over time, that really turned into university space and not Camden City space. Residents were routinely locked out of the fields, not able to access them regularly. We had to get newspaper articles written. I have an ongoing email chain since 2018 with Martha Sapp and Jessica Patterson over this issue. Which unfortunately, and I love the DEP and the work you do. I'm a direct beneficiary of it in many ways in the state of New Jersey, but in this case, Jessica Patterson just simply stopped responding on the email chain, even though she had done historical research into a few properties and said she would have an update. It just went to silence. I had a reminder on my calendar to follow up every couple months as a member of my local community organization, which is the longest continuously operating community organization in the city of Camden, the Cooper Grant Neighborhood Association, about these issues. And it fell off. This has been such an important issue in my community that we actually were even able to secure external funding through the Bread and Roses Community Foundation it was a call for funding for community organizations that have lack of access to public lands, and they believed we had a major case worth of funding due to Green Acres, lack of access to Green Acres funded properties in our community. And it's an outstanding issue. And one more specific case, in Camden, there's a Green Acres property known as Johnson Park, it's the Rittenhouse Square of Camden. It even has a similar Billy Goat statue that exists in Rittenhouse Square. They actually came and took a mold of it when the one in Rittenhouse Square broke down to so many people touching the bronze. In that facility, Green Acres funding was used not only to rehabilitate the historic park, but also for a historic library that existed in the center of the city, known as Johnson Park Library, also known as the Walt Whitman Arts Center. The Walt Whitman Arts Center was owned by the city and used by a performing arts nonprofit for decades, and was really a meeting hub for the community to have community meetings, to have dance classes. It was really a place of civic activity. That property was sold to Rutgers Camden for $1 decades ago. And Green Acres funding was used not only to rehab the park, but was actually used to rehab the building itself and installed ADA access entrances and a bathroom because it didn't have ADA access. Nowadays, that park is exclusively university-owned property. We have asked to hold local community meetings in it and have been flat out denied access to it. I think this is a violation of meaningful public access. I think if it's used on a historic structure, particularly one that for generations has been used for civic use, Institutions, particularly public institutions with very large budgets like Rutgers-Camden, should not be able to use the Green Acres program to fill gaps in its budget and really take advantage of a disinvested, majority Black and brown city like Camden. So I think I'm bringing up a lot of issues, but the core of my issue here is the meaningful public access clause, strengthening it or clearly defining it, having it be retroactively applied to Green Acres properties that already exist in the state of New Jersey, and opening up better communication between your legal compliance office and the community in general. Thank you.
So I appreciate the general comment as far as how we define public access, although I'll state for the record that that might be difficult to do, because if you saw the word meaningful public access, you were probably in the funding part of the rule where we talk about not funding projects that don't provide meaningful public access. In subchapter 25, we use the term reasonable public access, which is necessarily a little subjective as far as what the conditions are on the ground. I will say, though, as to your two examples, that Nancy and I are both completely familiar with them. I can assure you that Jessica Patterson has not forgotten about them. I can't say that anything has changed yet in reality there in the city, but that we've made multiple attempts to elevate this issue and we have not forgotten about it. So I know that's not much comfort here as we speak, but you know, I don't want to lay this at the feet of Jessica, who I think has been pretty diligent in trying to pursue this. But we have a lot of competing priorities, particularly in urban areas, and that's probably about all I could say about that at the moment. But I appreciate you bringing the general issue to our attention. And as I said, it might be a little difficult, but there might be some examples we could give of what people shouldn't be doing or what would be reasonable public access. So we'll see what we can do with that. I believe we had someone else from the public join us. So I think we have two additional members of the public and someone else from DEP on the phone with us. Does anyone else want to comment on anything specific?
I think with this small of a group, we can just do the raise hand function, or for those on the phone, just state your name and affiliation. Oh, so we do have Kim Ferrier just raised her hand. Kim, if you want to go ahead, thanks for raising your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Kim Ferrier. I'm a resident of Highbridge, New Jersey, and I'm part of the creative team, which also is working on our Grounds for Art project, which Mark Weatherby and Kirsten Norberg and Pierre Kirshenson has also been involved with. So we're just excited about making an open access space within the Green Acres, space in Tisco, and making it into something that's accessible to the community, bringing in some of the history of the space, and then bringing in some of the environmental side and some temporary artwork that comes in phases. And that's our plan moving forward, is just working towards that and sharing this information with the public. So we just wanted to hop on and just make sure that there weren't any changes to the guidelines that may apply to our Green Acre space and what our original plan was and agreed upon, so we can move forward in lockstep and make sure that we're in compliance and making everybody happy.
So I've actually been to that site, and it was in the context of a proposal from a prior administration to use the I want to call it the gym, but the metal building there.
Yes, yeah, there's there's a business office, and then there's Shop E, which is like
Shop E. I just couldn't remember the local name for it. So a prior administration wanted to put a brewery in there, and we were up there to tour the site. So I was excited to hear about the current plan. I'm curious whether the office building was ever restored, but
No,
because I think it's still a shell.
it's still a shell. Part of the plan was because we want to make sure that we're not actually impacting any of the historic elements, but we're accentuating it. So the windows of the historic place are right now boarded up, so it looks a little shabby because of the boarded up windows. So our concept was, when we have our opening, is to have those windows actually covered over with silhouettes that represent the history of what happened inside those historic buildings.
So without delving too much into your particular project, what I would say about a site like that is that we do realize, we've always said in the rules that we feel we could be more flexible with what can and can't happen in a historic structure, as long as those uses are structured in a way where either it will generate enough revenue to maintain the structure to historic standards, or the tenant itself will do the maintenance and restoration to historic standards. That's just mentioned very briefly in the current rules, and we realized quite a while ago that we need to give more detail about what we meant when we said we could be more flexible. So, and it comes down to really needing to make sure that what's being proposed is a bona fide historic preservation project, because that is part of our mission, and not just commercializing structures on parkland, which is not our mission. And I see Frank Pinto popped in. He'd probably have little to say about that based on his past experience with historic structures and Green Acres restrictions. But yeah, I think, Kim, if anything, we're going to be more specific about what our expectations are in an effort to find more uses for the historic structures and to actually get them restored. It's not always possible, but we'd like to not be an impediment there.
And ours is a creative team, and we reach out. We have arms and representatives on the historic side, on the environmental side, and then the community. So we definitely do not want to touch or impact historic structures. It's really like drawing people into the space so they can appreciate the historic structures, artwork around those structures, have it accessible. But we wouldn't even want to touch a historic structure that would need to be touched by a team that knows more about it.
Well, then it sounds like you're probably on pretty solid footing, and I don't anticipate that anything we're going to do in this rulemaking is going to change that. But if you ever have any questions, I'm guessing you're already dealing with Kevin Applegate, who's assigned to your county, and you can consult him if you're unsure about any of the details about what you're doing.
That's great. If I can share offline, if I can get Kevin's contact information, we'll just make sure that we touch base.
Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome.
Nice all of you.
We had a couple of members of the public join us after Kim started speaking, so I don't know if Eileen Murphy or Frank Pinto would like to speak, or whether they would like to listen.
Oh, here's Eileen. I'm just listening. Thank you. New Jersey Audubon.
Okay. Welcome, Eileen. Frank, would you like to comment, or you're here to listen? Okay. Caroline, I know we don't have a slide on the top topics list, but is it possible to switch to that? Or if Nancy or I, would that mess things up if Nancy or I pulled it up?
Well, I can stop sharing, and if you want to just share the screen.
Well, let me find it first before you stop sharing.
And I did know Benjamin Saraco put some another comment.
Right, that's specific to those Camden access issues, and we will follow up on that. Okay, hold on. I'm kind of queuing this up in a place where I can then share it. Sorry, I have it pulled up and I'm trying to get rid of something on the side. Okay, let me go back and try to share. Okay, there we go. Okay, so when we first advertised these stakeholder meetings, we compiled a list of hot topics, and those of you who were here when we were first speaking heard me say that these are not things that we've made decisions about, but they, to some extent, the issues on this list reflect issues that we get asked about frequently. So just in very general terms, we've been asking people whether we should make process changes or whether there are improvements they would suggest for the process for amending a recreation and open space inventory, for what's known as the change in use procedure, and for the notice requirements for public hearings, which we do recognize are burdensome and already have some thoughts about ways to make those requirements less burdensome. And then under the next bullet are, again, things we get asked about pretty frequently. I think there was a time pre-pandemic, definitely, but I think, things are starting to pick up again. We're getting questions about restaurants on parkland, food service vendors on parkland. Kind of, we grapple sometimes with what the limits should be on that, and when food service is an amenity for the park versus a destination in and of itself. We got a lot of questions about event space, particularly for weddings, but also indoor event spaces, which gets kind of difficult for us because our mission is public outdoor recreation. So indoor spaces on Green Acres funded parkland tend to be kind of limited to begin with, and then, turning them into event space and multi-purpose space is sometimes difficult. Lately, we've been getting questions about overnight parking on parks, particularly in urban areas. And then our fellow DEP employee who's on the phone will appreciate that, we do recognize that we probably need to say more about which flood control facilities and green infrastructure projects are allowable on parkland, particularly post Sandy and, in light of climate change. And then I mentioned earlier that we do oversee leasing of parkland, and we're interested in people's input about how we can improve our oversight while still protecting the parks. And we recognize that we need to say more in the rules about historic structures, and also the fact that on funded parkland, there sometimes needs to be bond council review of certain lease activities. And then kind of in the middle there, and related to something I think is elsewhere on the list, is we just spent a lot of time talking about and reviewing farm leases. Agriculture is not part of our definition, but farming does occur both on Green Acres encumbered local parkland and on parks owned by the DEP. Lately, that's kind of headed in the direction in some locations of people wanting to establish CSAs, community supported agriculture operations, mostly under the umbrella of a nonprofit. And there's been some questions about the extent to which greenhouses or hoop houses might be allowed as part of agricultural leases. We highlighted a couple of things that we get asked about with respect to active recreation, particularly non-resident user fees for funded parkland, and scheduling of athletic fields is a perennial issue, a perennial headache, something Nancy spends a lot of time sorting through. In our past stakeholder sessions, we've spent a fair amount of time talking about hunting. We really don't mention hunting in the current rules other than it being part of the definition of recreation and conservation purposes that governs all our Green Acres funding and administration, but we do get a lot of questions about hunting. There are kind of conflicts at the local level about hunting, who the hunting privileges are allocated to, whether hunting is even allowed, which we feel is up to the parkland owner. But then when hunting is allowed, how are those permits or privileges allocated fairly? And, how is reasonable access given to hunting? The last bullet on that page is that we, for a while, have been contemplating whether it would be possible to define a small category of solar projects on parkland that wouldn't involve tree clearing or interference with any recreational facilities, but would potentially be able to generate some revenue for the parkland owners to help manage their parks, again, while not interfering with the park. So generally speaking, we'd be talking about larger parks that have existing open areas where you might be able to cite a project that was entirely for the benefit of the park, and also encouraging more in the way of parking canopies and installation on structures. I would say the biggest topic so far on this list has been forestry. We've been getting a lot of questions about what constitutes forestry on parkland and what our program's role is in allowing or not allowing forestry. And there's some sub questions there. There's been a lot of tree removal by utilities to avoid impinging on lines, and we sometimes get questions about that. And then, we had posed the general question of whether we could improve the Green Acres diversion disposal application process. Eileen, I do see your hand up. I'll get to you in 1 second. And we had just posted some kind of conversation prompts there for people who have been through the process before to give us feedback. And then the big topic at the very end there is that when the allocation of the corporate business tax, when the funding formula was reauthorized in the present administration through the what's known sometimes as the Preserve New Jersey Act 2, the Green Acres program, but pretty specific to what's now part of the new office, was given penalty authority. In the past, our largest compliance tool has been the ability to withhold future funding from projects, and that's not always effective, particularly if towns or counties don't intend to take our money again. So we do now have monetary penalty authority for violations of the rules or the funding contracts, but we need to implement it in the new rules to really be able to use that authority. And then I mentioned earlier that the new chapter may include some things not specific to green post-funding compliance, and one of them might be some guidelines about how we go about processing releases of conservation restrictions, which the DEP commissioner does have oversight over. So, and again, we're open to other suggestions as well. There is a link to this hot topics document in the chat if you want to pull it up for yourself. I am going to stop sharing for the moment, but I'll pull it up again if anybody needs me to. So Eileen, if you'd like to comment.
Yeah, thank you. I regret that I didn't make it to your other stakeholder meeting where I understand forestry was raised. And I'm one of the 4 co-chairs on the forestry task force. I'm just putting that out there. I'm not going to talk about that because we haven't released our report yet. But for New Jersey Audubon, it's important to us to see that our forested lands are stewarded properly and that they're cared for and not neglected. And one way to do this is the allowance of some of the Green Acres funding to be used to care for and maintain forested lands, not just acquire them. We know that uh, with the threat of invasive species and other threats to our forests, it is even more important in the face of climate change to manage our forest and not neglect them. So I wanted to put that out there, and I do want to attend more of the stakeholder meetings to reflect that position. So thank you.
That's probably a position we haven't heard yet in the stakeholder meetings, not the way you precisely stated it. And I think I hear you saying that the stewardship component of the Green Acres funding should go towards forestry activities, but correct me if I'm wrong about that.
Correct.
Okay. I will tell you that most of the comment we've gotten up until now has been about not allowing forest stewardship plans to be implemented on parkland or ways to change that process, which I understand is part of what the task force is
Yeah,
looking
that's
at.
why I made a point to join today.
Okay.
I had heard about that, so I'll hope to attend future meetings and reflect this other point of view.
And we're somewhat stuck in the middle on this because we're not the forestry program. We don't have any foresters on staff.
Understood.
We have to rely on the expertise of our fellow DEP program, but I understand the concern of those citizens who say to us that they feel they didn't have an opportunity to comment on a proposed forestry plan because I think that process doesn't involve any public notice or public hearing. So I
Well,
think in the absence of that, people are turning to us and saying, do something, but we're
yeah,
not sure how involved we can
there
get.
was a 14 in the parks. I guess it's under N.J.A.C. So there is a 14-step process that the department uses for public input. There was much public input on those forest management plans. Then I would welcome the Green Acres folks and the parks and forestry folks to get together to truly understand what actually goes on versus what perhaps you're hearing just from stakeholders and NGOs.
And that 14-step process is the current process or the one that's being contemplated?
Oh, it has been used. It's
Okay.
not statutorily, it's not in a statute, but it's in department guidelines. And my understanding is that they do use it. Um, uh, Perhaps it should be in a statute, but it is a guideline that the department has used in the past and is currently using.
Okay, that's helpful. And when does the task force expect to finish its work? Do you know?
Yeah, imminently. So within the next couple of weeks, we'll be submitting the report to Senator Smith, and shortly after that, it will be available to the general public.
Okay. Thanks. That's really helpful. Frank Pinto, would you like to comment? I accept that you're muted.
I would like to comment now. Thank you, Judy. Hope you are well. I just wanted to bring up a thought about minor disposals and minor diversions, and this is from a recent one that I'm working on that I hope will be before the State House Commission very soon. It's a situation where it's a existing easement, trail easement that has never been built and is being relocated on the exact same property due to a redevelopment of the property. And it's an increase in acreage that will be there. It would be nice if there was a process where you as staff could handle this internally without it having to get scheduled for a State House Commission. It's it's a critical thing for the redevelopment to happen, and it's an affordable housing site, so there's public need public good for redoing or relocating the easement on the property. And that's basically it. It's not really a true impact to parkland because it was an easement on paper and the meets and bounds description is being changed. That's basically it. So just a comment that it might be helpful to have a more administrative process as opposed to going all the way through the State House Commission process with a sample like that.
So we would like nothing more than to be able to do something along the lines you're suggesting. 15 years ago, when we last did a major revision of the rules, is the first time we made the minor major distinction, and we tried to define a bunch of categories of relatively small diversions with an obvious public purpose, where we could, perhaps ease up a bit on the process. Unfortunately, in hindsight, we didn't ease up enough on the process. It's sometimes takes as long to process a minor diversion as a major, and but at the time, we just weren't sure if people were going to accept us making up that distinction. And it turns out in the end, people didn't have too much of a problem. But, we just didn't go far enough in distinguishing between minor and major. And I've been saying for a while that if we could figure out a way to either approve some diversions administratively or do something more akin to an approval, like a permit by rule type of scenario, that I'd like to. The impediment is that all the Green Acre statutes dating back to 1961 say that to get approval for a diversion, you need a public hearing. So we've talked in the past to the State House Commission about doing like a joint rulemaking and kind of pre-approving certain categories of diversions. But I just don't know how we address that hearing requirement, because it would seem to indicate you need a hearing on an individual diversion. I don't know that you could say that having hearing in 2022 for a category of diversions is going to cover you for the next 10 years for everything you might want to approve in that category. Like, I don't think individual citizens are going to feel that way when it comes to something in their town. So I don't know without a statutory change how far we can really go with that. I do have some other thoughts about how we can try to make that less burdensome, but that's the thing I'm grappling with right now, and we could talk about that more offline if you want to. So we share that objective. We're just trying to figure out how.
Okay, well, Judith, I wasn't implying that a public hearing isn't held in the town in which the diversion is occurring. But are you saying that the statute requires that the State House Commission itself must hold a public hearing?
Well, it requires that they can't approve something until there's really very little detail in the statute about what constitutes a diversion other than it's a, non-recreation, non-conservation use, and about the approval process other than that the DEP commissioner and the State House Commission approve something after a public hearing is held at least 30 days in advance of the State House Commission approval. So us approving something administratively probably isn't going to work, because it's one of the few things it says is you need the approval of the State House Commission after a public hearing. So again, we've talked to them in the past about kind of doing a joint rulemaking with us and approving a whole category of diversions to say, like, we trust you, DEP, we don't need to see these little tiny intersection improvements. But I don't know that that complies with the public hearing requirement. So, because it's specific to 30 days before they approve it. It's not 30 days before DEP approves it. So it's kind of this rolling thing that I don't know that we could carve out a category unless we just say it's not a diversion, and I don't know that that would fly either. So we're trying to figure it out. So like I said, we share that objective, but we think we have some impediments.
Well, just a thought, Judith. Maybe when the municipality sends out its public hearing notice for the public hearing it holds in the town, that could be a dual public hearing, that somehow the DEP, you meet the statutory requirement that way.
Yeah, I mean, we're still thinking it through, and again, if you want to talk about that in more detail, we can. But
okay.
Again, we share the objective. It's crazy sometimes that the smaller applications take just as much staff time as the larger ones, and that's not a good position for us to be in either. So,
Great.
with our limited staff.
Thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you. I think actually, I do see one name that wasn't on there originally. Are there any other members of the public who would like to speak? I think what we'll do, if there's no more public comment right now, is we will stay as we are and keep the recording on until we hit 2 o'clock. I think at that point we'll stop the recording, and Nancy actually has to leave us for another meeting. Caroline and I will stay on in case other members of the public joined late, and we can assure you that if we get additional public comment, we'll resume the recording and we'll post those additional comments on the website along with the recording of the first part of the meeting. We actually, 2 meetings ago, the recording stopped on its own, but we were able to stitch it together at the end. And then the last meeting we had, we stopped the recording and then someone jumped on to make one quick additional comment. So we're in the process of putting those pieces together so that we can post that online. So we'll hang out for another 5 minutes before we stop the recording. And then, if those who are listening or commenting want to leave, you're welcome to do that. But rest assured that if there's additional dialogue, we'll make a recording of that and we will post it. And as Caroline put up on the slide, we have 2 more meetings left. One this Thursday at the same time, 1 o'clock, and one evening meeting next week on the 31st, starting at 6 o'clock. Hopefully for members of the public who have not been able to attend during the day. And, we have a general goal or a general direction from our deputy commissioner of doing as much of this rulemaking process during this calendar year as we can. I think ideally he would like new rules adopted by the end of the year, but we're almost in February and we haven't written most of it. So that's probably a little overly ambitious, but our goal certainly is to propose something by the fall, and any comments or suggestions you send us over the next month or 2, we will still have an opportunity to take those into consideration. So again, we'll wait until 2 o'clock to stop the recording, and then Caroline and I will stay on the line to see if any other members of the public join in.
I'm gonna hop off now, ladies, and I will see you on the other side.
Thank you, Nancy.
Nancy.
Okay, I know I said 2 o'clock, but we're down to us and Eileen Murphy, so I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay, I'm just going to post a quick thank you and let them know that we're going to be monitoring